The blade was an inch from his throat when the villain smiled instead of flinching. Every soul in the kingdom feared the ruthless Omega King, a man who executed traitors before they finished their final sentence. But this villain carried a plan from another life: seduce the very king destined to kill him, one calculated glance at a time. Step 1 was simple: make him hesitate. It worked. The king's blade wavered mid-air, crimson eyes narrowing with something that wasn't fury anymore. Every guard in the hall held their breath, waiting for a strike that never came. What did this so-called villain whisper to make a king who had never shown mercy hesitate, and why? Stay with us to the end, and let's find out together exactly what this villain is planning next. Get comfortable? Because this is the story of a man who charmed the one king everyone else was too afraid to even look at. If you've ever flirted your way out of a situation you definitely started yourself, tell us about it in the comments below. Rain in Portland never announced itself. It simply arrived, soft and endless, the way grief does. Elliot Parker, 22 years old, second-year graduate student, certified Omega, and according to his roommate, the single most invested person alive in a web novel about a cursed Alpha Duke, was halfway through the last chapter of the Duke's Requiem when his phone buzzed with a text from his best friend Charlie. Charlie said, "Are you seriously still reading that book? It's midnight." Elliot said, "The Duke is about to die, Charlie. I cannot leave him like this, Charlie. You cried over a fictional alpha for 3 days last week, Elliot. He deserved better. He meant it too." Alexander Reed, Duke of Ashcombe, alpha by blood and monster by rumor, had spent 400 chapters being feared, used, and finally executed by the very court he'd bled for, while the novel's real hero, Golden Prince Sebastian, got the crown, the kingdom, and the omega of his dreams. Elliot had read the final chapter with his hand pressed over his mouth, furious in the specific, helpless way you get furious at something you can't fix. He closed his laptop at 12:47 a.m., grabbed his coat, and walked the 4 blocks to the all-night bakery on Hawthorne, because it was raining, and he wanted a cinnamon roll, and he was an adult who could make his own terrible decisions at midnight. He never made it there. The last thing Elliot Parker saw in his old life was a delivery van running the red light on SE 12th, headlights smearing gold across wet asphalt, and the last thing he thought absurdly, achingly was, "I never even got to find out what happened to the Duke's dog." The last thing he felt was nothing. And then he felt everything: straw beneath his back, wool blankets too coarse for any mattress he'd ever owned, and a headache like a bell being struck inside his skull. He opened his eyes to a wooden ceiling, exposed beams, and a maid in a long gray dress screaming his name. "Young Master Elliot! Young Master Elliot, thank the gods you're awake!" My name, he thought, staring at her, is Elliot. That was the first clue. The second clue came when he caught his reflection in the window glass an hour later, same warm brown eyes, same soft mouth, same faint dusting of freckles across the nose, but younger, and dressed in the kind of high-collared tunic no one in Portland, Oregon had worn since roughly the 14th century. The third clue was the book on the nightstand, hand-copied and leather-bound, titled in gold leaf, A History of the Ashcombe Line. Elliot picked it up with hands that were his and not his, and understood, with the calm, horrified clarity of someone watching a car crash in slow motion for the second time, exactly where and when and who he had woken up as. He was Elliot Hart, 22 years old, the same age he'd been in Portland, which felt like either a cosmic coincidence or a very tired universe reusing the same number twice. Baron's son, Omega. A minor character who appeared in exactly 6 chapters of the Duke's Requiem and existed, as far as the plot was concerned, to attend 2 parties and die quietly of a fever in chapter 210 so that Prince Sebastian would have something to be sad about for a paragraph. "I'm an extra," Elliot whispered to the empty room. "I got hit by a delivery van and reincarnated as background noise." Then he thought of the Duke dead by the book's end, alone, unloved, executed on a false charge, with no one standing beside him when the blade came down, and something in Elliot's chest, some stubborn, romance novel-shaped part of his soul, set its jaw. "Not this time," he said out loud, and the maid, still hovering in the doorway, looked deeply concerned. The Ashvale Royal Academy sat on a hill above the capital of Kingsmere, all grey stone and ivy, and the kind of architecture that made Elliot feel like he'd wandered onto the world's most elaborate Renaissance fair set, except the cold was real, the mud on his boots was real, and the crushing weight of I have 4 months before I'm supposed to catch a fatal fever and die was extremely, unbearably real. He'd spent his first week doing what any self-respecting reincarnated bookworm would do, frantically reconstructing the plot from memory while pretending to know how to hold a soup spoon correctly. The broad strokes came back to him easily, because he'd read the Duke's Requiem 3 times and cried through the ending twice. Crown Prince Sebastian Hayes, golden-haired, golden-hearted, destined to inherit the throne was, in this timeline, still 2 months away from meeting his soulmate, a quiet kind Omega named Noah Bennett, son of a minor court scholar. Their romance would unfold slowly, sweetly, over the following year, culminating in a wedding that made the whole kingdom weep, and Duke Alexander Reed Alpha, 26, heir to a bloodline cursed, according to gossip, with a temper that could kill, would spend that same year being blamed for things he didn't do, isolated by nobles too afraid of his scent-marked reputation to get close, and eventually framed for treason by his own uncle, the Duke of Ravensmore, who wanted the Ashcombe lands for himself. Elliot had cried the hardest, both times, at the chapter where Alexander stood alone at his own trial, with not one person willing to speak in his defense. Well, Elliot thought, watching a cluster of nobles jeer at a tall, black-coated figure across the academy courtyard, he has someone now, Alexander Reed, 26 years old, Duke of Ashcombe, Alpha. 6'3" of silence and scar tissue, with a scent the Omegas at court described, depending on how brave they were feeling, as either like a storm about to break or terrifying. Actually, please don't make me sit near him at dinner. He had crimson dark eyes that never quite settled on anyone, hands large enough to look dangerous even when they weren't doing anything, and a reputation 10 years in the making that he had stopped bothering to correct. Can't even control himself in a ballroom. My cousin said his own hound won't go near him. Heard he broke a man's wrist just for bumping into him. Elliot watched Alexander's jaw tighten, watched his shoulders draw up like a wall, going into place brick by brick, and felt something in his own chest twist with a fury that had nothing to do with the plot and everything to do with the simple, unbearable fact of watching someone be cruel to another person for sport. "Excuse me?" Elliot said, stepping between them before his brain had finished consulting his sense of self-preservation. "Sorry, I need to borrow him." 6 nobles and 1 duke stared at him. "Borrow me," Alexander repeated, flat, like the words tasted strange in his mouth. "Mm-hmm." Elliot grabbed his sleeve's soft black wool, warm from his body heat, which was a detail Elliot's brain filed away and immediately regretted filing away and pulled. "We had plans, remember? The thing. With the you know, I do not know," Alexander said. "The pastries," Elliot hissed under his breath, tugging harder. "Just walk with me, tall, dark, and misunderstood, to the eternal shock of everyone present, including..." Visibly Alexander himself he went. They rounded the corner of the East Hall in silence, Elliot's heart hammering with the specific adrenaline of a person who has just interrupted a scene from a novel he definitely wasn't supposed to be a character in. When the nobles' voices faded behind them, Alexander finally stopped and looked down at the hand still curled around his sleeve, like Elliot had forgotten it was there. Elliot let go, cheeks warming. "Sorry, I don't actually know if there are pastries." I panicked. "You interrupted 6 of the Marchdale set," Alexander said slowly, "to save a man you have never spoken to, over a lie about desserts. When you say it like that, it sounds worse. It was already bad." But there Elliot caught it, quick as a struck match. Gone almost before it registered, the very corner of Alexander's mouth had moved. Not a smile, barely the ghost of the idea of one. But real. Oh, Elliot thought, with the sudden dropping elevator feeling of a man who has just made an enormous, life-altering miscalculation about how easy this was going to be. Oh no. The bakery, it turned out, existed. Elliot had been bluffing about the specific promise but not about the general concept. And by sheer dumb luck, there was a shop 2 streets over called Mireille's, all butter smell and fogged windows, run by a stout woman who took one look at the Duke of Ashcombe, standing awkwardly in her doorway, and nearly dropped an entire tray of rolls. "He won't bite," Elliot told her cheerfully, steering Alexander toward a corner table. "I have never bitten anyone," Alexander said, sitting down like a man lowering himself into unfamiliar water. "See, that's the kind of thing you should be leading with. Hello, I am Alexander Reed. I have never bitten anyone." Very reassuring. Put it on a pamphlet. Alexander looked at him for a long moment, the particular look Elliot was starting to notice, that he gave things he couldn't quite categorize. You're strange, he said finally. I get that a lot. Elliot slid a plate of blackberry tarts between them, purely because they looked good, and because it gave his hands something to do that wasn't fidgeting under that unreadable crimson stare. Eat. You look like a man who hasn't had anything sweet since the last coronation. I don't like sweets. You haven't met the right bakery. Alexander picked up the tart like he expected it to argue with him, took a bite out of pure obligation, and stopped. Elliot watched, delighted, as the Duke's carefully composed face did something complicated and unguarded, just for a second, jaw working, brows drawing together like he'd been personally betrayed by a pastry. That's Alexander started. Good, acceptable. That's basically a marriage proposal coming from you, isn't it? Something that was almost a laugh escaped Alexander before he visibly wrestled it back down, and Elliot felt it land somewhere behind his ribs and stay there, warm as the bakery around them, glowing. He laughed, Elliot thought, watching Alexander school his face back into its usual careful stillness a beat too late. I made the villain laugh in week 1. The book gave him 400 chapters and never once managed that. He didn't examine too closely why his chest felt so full about it. There would be time to panic about that later. For now, there was a Duke across the table, pretending very hard he hadn't just enjoyed a blackberry tart, and Elliot intended to enjoy every second of watching him fail at it. By the second week, the Academy had opinions. They eat lunch together every day, whispered a girl at the next table. I heard Lord Reed smiled at him. Lord Reed doesn't smile. Lord Reed doesn't have a smile. It was probably wind. Elliot's best friend, Charlie Evans, 19, sharp-tongued, the only other person at the Academy who'd somehow guessed within a week that Elliot was hiding something enormous and was too polite, or too nosy, not to ask about it, eventually cornered him in the library with the particular gleam of a man about to enjoy himself. So, Charlie said, dropping into the seat across from him. Rumor mill says you're courting the Duke of Nightmares. We're friends, Charlie. You held his hand at the archery range. I tripped. He caught me. You trip a lot around him. I'm clumsy. You've never once tripped around me, and I've watched you walk into a doorframe. Elliot opened his mouth, found he had no rebuttal prepared, and closed it again. Charlie grinned, delighted. That's what I thought. It's not. Elliot dropped his voice, glancing around the library like the shelves themselves might report back to Alexander. It's not like that. I'm just trying to make sure he doesn't. He stopped himself before die in 3 months could escape his mouth. Doesn't what? Doesn't spend his whole life alone. Elliot finished, quieter, and found that it was true in a way that had nothing to do with plot mechanics anymore. Everyone decided who he was before he ever got a say in it. I don't think that's fair. Charlie's teasing smile softened into something gentler. You've always been like that. Even back home, you'd bring in every stray that showed up at the shelter, remember? The mean-looking pit bull nobody wanted. Back home. Elliot's throat tightened. Charlie meant the version of Charlie that lived in this world, some noble's second son with a love of gossip and an easy laugh, who had never set foot in Portland and never would. But the echo of it, the accidental truth buried in a joke, hit him somewhere soft. Yeah, Elliot said. Something like that. Omegaverse biology, Elliot had learned in the mortifying week following his arrival, was not something the Duke's Requiem had bothered explaining in detail, which meant he was discovering the rules the hard way in real time with his own body as the test subject. He learned that alphas could read an omega's mood in their scent the way other people read faces. He learned that a distressed omega gave off something sharp and green, like crushed grass, and a content one went warm and sweet, like sun-baked bread. He learned this because Alexander, 3 weeks into their strange, tart-fueled friendship, showed up at Elliot's family's townhouse unannounced, stood in the doorway with his usual unreadable expression, and said, "You were distressed yesterday. At the tournament." Elliot blinked. "I was fine." "Your scent wasn't." Alexander held out a small paper-wrapped parcel, stiff and formal, like he'd rehearsed the gesture and still wasn't confident in it. "Myriel says these are for headaches." Elliot unwrapped it, dried chamomile, tied with string, and felt something in his chest go warm and loose and entirely unhelpful to his ability to remain casual about any of this. "You went to the bakery, for me, without me making you. I go there sometimes." Alexander's ears had gone the faintest bit red, a detail Elliot was absolutely never going to let him live down. "The tarts are acceptable." "Acceptable. Right." Elliot bit back a grin. New rumor about the Duke of Ashcombe smuggling chamomile. He stepped back to let Alexander through the door. And their shoulders brushed in the narrow entryway, an accident of space. Nothing more, and Elliot caught, for just a moment, the scent Charlie had once tried and failed to describe to him. Something like wood smoke and cold rain, and underneath it, quiet as a held breath, something warmer. Not a storm at all, up close. More like the hour just after 1, when the air goes soft and everything smells like it's been washed clean. Alexander went very still. "What?" Elliot asked. "Nothing," Alexander said, too fast, and did not meet his eyes for the rest of the visit. And Elliot spent that whole evening replaying the moment and feeling, against every instinct of self-preservation he had left, absurdly, hopelessly pleased. The months went by strangely both slower and faster than Elliot expected. The way time does when you're building something you're afraid to name. The fever that was supposed to take him in Chapter 210 came and went sometime in his second month at the academy, a miserable, sweat-soaked week he spent buried under every blanket in his rooms, certain, in his worst moments, that the story had simply been delayed rather than escaped. But it was Alexander who sat up 2 nights running with cold cloths and boiled willow bark tea, refusing to leave despite Elliot's protests that dukes did not sit vigil over barons' sons, and it was Alexander's stubborn, silent presence that Elliot decided, once his fever finally broke, had made all the difference. He never told him what the illness was supposed to have meant. Some things, he thought, were better left as a secret between himself and a book that no longer got to decide how his story ended. He learned that Alexander, contrary to every rumor circulating the capital, was almost pathologically gentle with things smaller than him, that he fed the stray cats behind the academy stables every morning before dawn so no one would see him do it, that he'd once spent an entire afternoon carefully resetting a bird's wing with strips of linen instead of simply letting it die, that he read poetry in his rooms at night and had never told a single living soul. He learned this last one by accident, having wandered uninvited into Alexander's study looking for him, and finding instead a slim, well-worn volume of verse open on the desk, its spine cracked from use. "You read poetry," Elliot said, delighted, when Alexander found him there. "Put that down. You dog-eared the pages." Alexander Reed, terror of the capital, dog-ears his poetry books like an absolute menace to literature. "I will remove you from my household." "You'd have to catch me first." Elliot held the book just out of reach, grinning, and Alexander, 6'3", broad-shouldered, capable by rumor of breaking a man's wrist without trying, lunged for it with all the grace of an alpha who had genuinely never chased anyone playfully in his life and had no idea what to do with his own limbs while doing it. Elliot laughed so hard he had to sit down. Alexander, book finally recovered and clutched to his chest like contraband, looked at him, really looked, the careful mask slipping the way it only did around Elliot now, and said quietly, "No one has ever laughed at me like that." "Like what?" "Like it wasn't cruel." The laughter died in Elliot's throat, replaced by something that ached in a completely different way. He crossed the room before he'd decided to, and reached up. Alexander was so much taller that it required an actual reach to tuck back a lock of dark hair that had fallen loose over his brow. "Nobody's ever laughed at you unkindly around me either," Elliot said softly. "I don't plan on starting." Alexander's hand came up slow, like he was giving Elliot every chance to step back, and covered Elliot's where it still rested near his temple. His palm was warm and rough with old sword calluses, and it swallowed Elliot's hand whole. Neither of them moved for a long moment. The candlelight guttered. Somewhere outside, a cart rattled over cobblestones. "Elliot," Alexander said, low, like the name cost him something to say. "What are we?" "Everything," Elliot thought. "Wild and sudden and terrifying. I flew across a species, a body, an entire universe to find out." What he said, because his heart was beating too hard to manage anything braver, was, "Ask me again after the harvest festival." Alexander's mouth curved the real smile now, the one Elliot had spent months coaxing out of hiding, rare as a comet. "I'll hold you to that." It was around this time that the Academy's other great romance finally began in earnest, and Elliot, despite every instinct telling him to keep his head down and stay out of plot-critical events, could not resist watching it happen with the giddy nostalgia of someone rereading his favorite chapter. Prince Sebastian Hayes, 23, Crown Prince of Ashville, golden-haired and golden-hearted in the literal, storybook sense, the kind of alpha who made rooms brighter just by walking into them, and destined by the whole weight of the narrative to marry for love rather than politics, much to his father's despair and the court gossip's delight. Noah Bennett, 21, son of the royal court scholar, an omega with ink-stained fingers, and a laugh he tried, unsuccessfully, to hide behind his hand. Quiet where Sebastian was loud, steady where Sebastian was restless, the exact opposite pull that made a good story work. Elliot found them by accident one evening, cutting through the palace gardens on his way to meet Alexander, and stopped dead behind a hedge of white roses at the sight of Prince Sebastian, gently tucking a loose curl behind Noah's ear. "You've been working too hard," Sebastian murmured. "I wanted to finish the translations before I saw you," Noah said. And even from behind the hedge, Elliot could hear the smile in it. "Let me help next time." "They're perfect," Elliot thought, chest full to bursting, and backed away as quietly as he could manage directly into a solid wall of black wool that had definitely not been standing there before. "Oh, sorry." Elliot spun around and found himself nose to collarbone with Alexander, who had apparently come to find him and arrived just in time to watch him eavesdrop on the crown prince's love life. "They suit each other," Alexander observed, glancing past him toward the roses. "They really do," Elliot agreed, and let himself, just for a moment, feel nothing but simple happiness for two people he'd once only known as ink on a page, people who now had faces, and laughs, and a garden full of white roses, because of choices that were entirely their own. The story's still happening, he thought. It's just not the only story anymore. The Harvest Festival lit up all of Kingsmere in amber and gold lantern-strung streets, cider stalls, fiddle music drifting from every square, the whole capital smelling of roasted chestnuts and wood smoke, and the particular electric joy of an entire city deciding for one night to be happy together. Elliot found Alexander waiting for him at the edge of the East Bridge, dressed down from his usual severe court black into something softer, a deep green that made his eyes look less like a storm, and more like the hour just after, and Elliot's traitorous heart did something complicated and undignified at the sight of him. "You came," Elliot said, breathless, more from the run through the crowd than anything else. "Probably." "I said I would." They walked the festival together, unhurried, Alexander's hand, finding the small of Elliot's back at every crowded corner like it, had simply always belonged there, and Elliot let himself lean into it, let himself stop pretending the touches were accidents. Near midnight, they climbed the low hill above the river to watch the lantern release thousands of paper lights drifting up into the dark, gold against the stars, the whole crowd below laughing and calling out wishes. "This world is beautiful," Elliot said, watching the lanterns rise. "It is," Alexander agreed. He wasn't looking at the sky. Elliot turned, caught the look, and felt his breath go entirely out of his control. "You're not even watching the lanterns. I've seen lanterns before." Alexander's voice had dropped low, rough at the edges. "I hadn't seen this." "Seen what?" "You." "Laughing like the whole world hasn't already told you what to expect from it." He stepped closer, close enough that Elliot had to tip his head back to hold his gaze, close enough that Elliot could feel the warmth radiating off him even in the cool night air. "Before you, Elliot, everything in my life was quiet, not peaceful, just silent. Like waiting for something that never came. And now I understand what I was waiting for." Alexander's hand came up, cupping Elliot's jaw with a gentleness that seemed impossible for hands that size, thumb tracing the curve of his cheek like he was memorizing it. "I love you. I think I have for months, and I was too much of a coward to say it before someone tried to steal you back from me." Nobody's ever loved him in this story, Elliot thought, eyes stinging, and here he is, loving me first. "I love you too," Elliot whispered, and it came out wrecked, overflowing, months of careful, terrified restraint dissolving into 3 simple words. "I have since the blackberry tarts, I think, since you tried so hard to hate them and failed." Alexander laughed, really laughed, helpless and startled by his own joy, and then he was kissing him, soft at first and then not soft at all, one hand cradling the back of Elliot's head like something precious, the other pulling him in by the waist until there was no space left between them at all. Above them the last of the lanterns drifted into the dark, and below them the whole city sang, and Elliot Hart, whoever he was now, in whatever world this was, kissed the villain of his favorite novel back with everything he had. Happiness, in stories and in life, tends to attract attention. Roman Castillo, Duke of Ravensmore, 51, Alexander's uncle by marriage and, by royal decree, his named successor should the Ashcombe line ever be attainted for treason, silver-haired and silver-tongued, a man who had spent a decade quietly engineering his nephew's downfall, knowing that a conviction would see the Ashcombe lands stripped from Alexander and reassigned by law to the next loyal claimant in line. In the novel, he had succeeded completely. Elliot intended to make sure he didn't. "It's the Omega," Ravensmore said flatly, watching from his window as Alexander actually laughed, unguarded at something Elliot had said in the courtyard below. "That's why every trap has failed. That's why he hasn't gone anywhere near the West Road at night in months. Someone is warning him." His steward shifted uneasily. "My lord, remove the Omega," Ravensmore said, "and the Duke goes back to being exactly as alone and exactly as easy to destroy as he was always meant to be." Elliot had read this chapter of the novel 3 times and knew, with the sick certainty of someone watching a familiar nightmare start up again, more or less how it would unfold. An ambush, a warehouse, a trap meant for Alexander that Elliot could reroute onto himself instead, because in the original story, no one had ever been positioned to take that blow for the Duke, and that omission was precisely why the conspiracy had succeeded. He left the academy alone on a rain-soaked Thursday, telling Charlie he was going to the bookshop, and walked deliberately down the one road he'd spent 4 months carefully avoiding. "Please work," he thought, heart hammering. "Please just work." The warehouse smelled of wet grain and rust. Elliot had counted 4 masked men before the 5th one spoke, and by then it was too late to run. "There he is," one of them said. "Easier than expected." "I read the script," Elliot muttered, backing toward a stack of crates, heart slamming. "What? Nothing. Never mind." They came at him in a rush, and Elliot, who possessed exactly 0 combat training in either of his lives, did the only thing his panicking body could think to do, which was shove an entire stack of grain crates directly into their path. 2 men went down in a hail of wooden slats. A third slipped on the spilled contents and took out a hanging lantern on the way to the floor. "I'm not even trying," Elliot thought, half hysterical, scrambling backward, and I'm still winning. What Elliot didn't know was that an alpha's bond scent, once formed, doesn't stay quiet just because its owner is trying to be brave. Charlie had noticed Elliot's hands shaking when he lied about the bookshop and, uneasy, had gone straight to Alexander instead of letting it go. And Alexander 3 streets away, in the middle of a council meeting he would later have no memory of walking out of, had simply known, the way he'd learned to know Elliot's moods months ago, that something underneath his ribs had gone wrong. He hadn't needed an address. He'd followed the thread of Elliot's scent through half of Kingsmere like a man following the only sound in a silent room. The warehouse door didn't open so much as it detonated inward. "Move away from him." Alexander's voice cracked through the room like the storm his scent had always promised and never quite delivered until now. His eyes were black crimson and terrible, and the 4 remaining men, who had presumably heard every rumor Kingsmere had ever whispered about the Duke of Ashcombe, took one look at his face and decided, collectively and correctly, that none of the stories had done him justice. It was over in under a minute. Alexander crossed the warehouse floor and pulled Elliot into his arms so hard the breath left him, one hand fisted in the back of his coat, the other cradling his skull like he was checking frantically that all the pieces were still where they belonged. "You intended to draw them away from me," Alexander said, voice shaking in a way Elliot had never heard from him. "You planned this." It seemed efficient. "Elliot," his name broke in the middle, and Alexander pressed his forehead down against Elliot's, breathing hard, holding on like letting go might make the last 5 minutes real. "I nearly lost you. I'm here." Elliot wrapped his arms around him, feeling the tremor still running through that enormous frame, feeling for the first time exactly how frightened a man could be underneath all that armor. "I'm okay. I'm right here." "Never," Alexander said, low and rough. "Do that again." "I couldn't let it happen to you," Elliot whispered. "Not again." Alexander pulled back just enough to search his face. "Again?" And so, sitting on an overturned crate, in a wrecked warehouse, with rain drumming on the roof, and Alexander's coat draped over his shoulders, Elliot finally told him everything not about phones or highways or a boy named Elliot Parker who used to live an ocean and a universe away. But enough. "I dreamed another life," he said. "In it you died, alone. No one stood beside you at the end." "I couldn't watch that happen twice." Alexander listened in silence, and when Elliot finished, he took both of Elliot's hands in his, swallowing them entirely. the way he always did, and pressed a kiss to each set of knuckles like a vow. "Then you've been protecting me," he said, "since the very first day. I couldn't save everyone in that story," Elliot admitted, "but I wanted to save you." "You did," Alexander said, and the look on his face was one the novel had never once given him. Not fear, not fury, not grief, just love, plain and whole and entirely his own. "You did." The warehouse, it turned out, was the mistake that finally broke Ravensmoor's plan wide open, not because it succeeded, but because it forced his hand into the open where witnesses could see it. Combined with the evidence Elliot had spent the months before that night quietly gathering Ravensmoor's steward, terrified and turned, the forged ledgers Elliot had accidentally stumbled across during a very deliberate afternoon in the archive room, the warehouse thugs eager to trade testimony for leniency, the conspiracy that had once ended Alexander's life instead unraveled it in front of the entire imperial court. Ravensmoor was arrested mid-sentence, still insisting on his innocence as guards led him out, the corrupt nobles who'd fed him information scattered like startled birds. And Alexander Reed, Duke of Ashcombe, once the most feared, most isolated man in Kingsmere, walked out of that courtroom, not as a condemned traitor, but as the man who'd survived a decade of quiet sabotage with his honor, and finally his heart entirely intact. At the celebration that followed, Prince Sebastian raised his glass across the hall, Noah's hand tucked warmly in his own. "Lord Reed," he called out, grinning, "I believe young Master Hart has done more for you than saved your title." Alexander glanced across the room to where Elliot stood arguing, with great passion, with Charlie over whether the almond cakes or the blackberry tarts were superior, a debate Elliot was, notably, losing on volume alone. "He gave me a future," Alexander said simply, "and clearly a great deal of opinions about pastries. That as well, he didn't deny it. He never did anymore. The palace held 2 weddings that spring, a year almost to the day since a very ordinary man had died on a rainy street 4,000 miles and 1 entire universe away. The first belonged to Crown Prince Sebastian Hayes and Noah Bennett, all trumpets and silk, and the whole kingdom turned out in the streets to cheer for the future they represented. The second was smaller, quieter, held beneath a canopy of blooming cherry trees in the Ashcombe Gardens, with only the people who actually mattered in attendance, Charlie loudly weeping into a handkerchief he insisted was just allergies, Noah and Sebastian hand in hand in the front row, Morel from the bakery crying harder than anyone and threatening to disown Alexander if he didn't finish his slice of cake. Elliot stood at the end of the aisle in pale ceremonial robes, hands shaking, and thought, not for the first time I read this story from the outside once. I never thought I'd get to stand inside it. I can't believe this is happening. Elliot whispered as Alexander took his hands. "It is," Alexander said, that rare, real smile breaking fully across his face, the one that used to take Elliot weeks to earn and now arrived so easily it made his chest ache. "I read a book about a villain once," Elliot said, voice wobbling. "I cried when he died alone. I never imagined I'd end up marrying him." "I was never a villain," Alexander murmured, leaning down until his forehead rested against Elliot's, the whole garden and every guest in it fading to background noise. "I was only ever waiting for the person brave enough to say so. I chose you," Elliot said. "You stole me," Alexander corrected, and kissed him before the officiant had even finished the vows, to the enormous scandal and greater delight of every single guest. Somewhere behind them, Charlie could be heard loudly informing Morel that he had, in fact, called this exact outcome 6 months ago and had the receipts to prove it. 2 years later, the thing nobody warned Elliot about, in either of his lives, was that being married to a duke was approximately 80% paperwork, 15% diplomatic dinners, and 5% watching your husband try, with visible and endearing failure, to learn how to properly ice a cake. "You're supposed to spread it," Elliot said, watching Alexander apply frosting to a blackberry tart with all the delicate precision of a man laying siege to a castle. "Not trowel it on like you're repairing a wall. Morel does it faster. Morel has been doing it for 30 years, love. Give yourself a week." Alexander shot him a look, the dry, long-suffering one that had replaced, months ago, his old default expression of icy remove, and which Elliot privately considered his greatest personal achievement. "You could help, instead of critiquing, and rob you of the character development? Absolutely not." Elliot leaned across the kitchen counter, stole a bit of frosting off the knife with one finger, and grinned when Alexander caught his wrist to stop him. It's for quality control. It's theft. It's love, actually. You should know the difference by now. Alexander made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sigh, and was, in truth, mostly just the noise a man makes when he has long since given up trying to win arguments against his husband and is simply enjoying losing them instead. He tugged Elliot's stolen finger to his mouth and licked the frosting off with a wicked, deliberate slowness that made Elliot's whole face go instantly catastrophically red. "That's you can't just, Alexander. You started it. I did not. Charlie's going to walk in any minute. He does not need to see." "See what?" said Charlie, walking in. Elliot yelped, ripping his hand back like he'd been burned, and Charlie, 22 now, still incapable of minding his own business, currently visiting from the capital with an armful of wedding gifts for a cousin's betrothal, took one look at the two of them, the frosting, the twin guilty expressions, and grinned wide enough to split his face in half. "You two are somehow worse now than before you were married," he announced. "I didn't think that was scientifically possible. We're domestic," Elliot said with as much dignity as he could summon. "You're disgusting is what you are." Charlie dropped into a kitchen chair, stealing a tart off the cooling rack without asking. "Also, this is terrible, Alexander. You frosted it like you were angry at it. I was concentrating. You were scowling at pastry. I scowl at everything. It's my face." "It is not your face anymore," Elliot cut in, delighted, wrapping both arms around Alexander from behind and resting his chin on one broad shoulder. "Your face does all sorts of things now," smiling, laughing. "That thing you do with your eyebrow when you're trying not to laugh at something and failing. I don't do that. You're doing it right now." Alexander turned his head just enough to press a kiss to Elliot's temple, soft and unhurried, the kind of small, ordinary tenderness that still, after 2 years, made Elliot's chest go warm and full in a way he suspected it never, ever wouldn't. Outside the kitchen window, blackberries hung heavy on the garden hedge, and somewhere down the hill Kingsmere was going about its ordinary business, entirely unaware that its most feared duke spent his mornings feeding stray cats and burning frosting, and being, without question, the happiest man in the entire kingdom. "For the record," Elliot murmured, "just for him, I'd choose you again. Every version of this story. Every single time." "Good," Alexander said, low, certain, turning fully in his arms to kiss him properly this time, frosting sticky fingers and Charlie's exaggerated gagging noises, and the whole ridiculous, ordinary, miraculous shape of their life together. "Because I already told you. I was never stolen, Elliot. No, no." He smiled easy now, unguarded, the smile of a man who'd spent a decade being told he was a monster, and had in the end simply been waiting for someone to tell him otherwise. "I chose you first. I've just been letting you win the argument about it ever since." Charlie, from the table, made a loud retching noise into his tart, and neither of them cared even a little. If this story stuck with you, we'd love to hear which moment got you the most. Drop it in the comments. We genuinely read every one. Hit subscribe and turn on the bell so you never miss the next villain who refuses to play by the script. Thank you for hanging out with us here. You're the whole reason we keep telling these stories.